You're listening to Skills World Live with Tom Buick. News, views and interviews in association with FE News. Hello everyone. Welcome to another week of Skills World Live. For listeners in the UK, I hope you enjoyed that hot and sunny bank holiday weekend. Because only in partial lockdown Britain, it now appears, can we fully venture out on a Dominic Cummings-inspired trip to Barnard Castle. We've been enjoying a month where that dank, grey, wet weather we're so famous for the world over has actually cleared to provide some sunshine in old Blighty on a scale of reliability that even the Costa del Sol would be hard-pressed to match. But have no fear, this is the show where only your ears, not the quality of your eyesight, or your particular interpretation of the lockdown rules on visiting family homes is required. Because on this channel, we're the only community radio station connecting the world of FE. That's right. It doesn't matter if you've got an updated prescription from Specsavers or not. We're here to bring you all the best guests and topical debates that's driving interest in all the wonderful work that you do. On tonight's show, we're delving into the complex world of careers, advice and guidance. We're asking the question, is it fit for purpose? Just like those stories about your first day at school or in the workplace, everyone, it seems, has their own tale about the first time they encountered careers education, or perhaps the lack of it. For my part, I still vividly remember circa 1987 and answering a few multiple choice questions on what looked like a cheap brick of an Amstrad computer attached to an age-old teleprinter. As I eagerly ripped off my careers report, the genius of 80s computer programming was there to see. It had managed to work out that my best careers destination was going to be as an asphalt spreader. That's right, folks. Your FE community radio DJ impresario was once related and slated to be doing no more glamorous a role than that of a much-needed pothole repairer. You're listening to Skills World Live with Tom Buick. On this evening's programme, I'll be exploring whether the chair of the House of Commons Education Select Committee, Robert Halfon, has been right to be so critical about the state of England's patchwork of a careers support system. After the news, I'll be talking to tonight's special guest and the man at the centre of this debate, John Yarham, who is the Interim CEO of the Careers and Enterprise Company. In the middle of the show, I'll be checking in with a retired distinguished careers advisor who represents the National Association, Careers England. He'll be joined in our three-way debate by the founder of an award-winning company set up in 2015 as the Career Alchemy. And do stay tuned, folks, for the closing part of the programme when we'll be hearing from a careers education author who's received an OBE no less for her pioneering work on careers guidance. And she'll be joined by a serving employability advisor at the Sheffield Hallam University. But first, let's find out what's making the news headlines in your skills world this evening. Prime Minister Boris Johnson announced over the holiday weekend that the date for reopening of educational settings for Year 10 and Year 12 pupils has been pushed back to the 15th of June. The Department for Education had originally said it was expecting a phased reopening of schools, colleges and training providers from the 1st of June. A DfE spokesperson said that the guidance will now be updated and that ministers had always been clear that they would follow the scientific advice before making the final decision about the date for a phased reopening of physical post-16 learning. In other news, as the Equal Pay Act enters its 50th anniversary, the number of employment tribunal claims is still high, according to the global law firm DLA Piper. the Equal Pay Act was given royal assent on the 29th of May 1970 and implemented the principle that men and women should receive equal pay for equal work. Since 2008, employment tribunals in England and Wales have received more than 368,000 complaints related to equal pay, averaging almost 29,000 complaints a year. And finally, a Newbury College hairdressing student, Lisa Jane Lamb, has picked up her scissors for a different type of trim, this time in support of the NHS. Instead of cutting hair due to lockdown restrictions, she's been cutting material to make scrubs and other vital PPE equipment to help keep both NHS and social care workers protected during the pandemic. That's all your Skills World news from fenews.co.uk. Contact us at Skills World Live. Email skillsworld@fenews.co.uk. Follow us on Twitter @Tom Buick, @FENews. Use the hashtag SkillsWorld. Call us on 02032 900 111. That's 02032 900 111. Blinded by the Night by Stray Bandit from our old friends over at our independent music site of choice, epidemicsound.com. And for those eagle-eyed amongst you, or eagle listeners amongst you, you'll know that was one of the tracks that appeared on the latest Van Allen mix over the bank holiday. Now, to kick off tonight's big debate on whether careers advice is fit for purpose in England, we're going to speak to the head of the Careers and Enterprise Company, John Yarham, former deputy and now the interim CEO, joins me on the line. Good evening, John.
Hi, Tom. Good to speak to you.
Yeah, and you. Thanks for coming on. Now, John, it's been a statutory requirement since 2013 for schools and FE providers to ensure students get access to impartial advice and guidance. 7 years on, though, how close are schools and colleges, in your view, to delivering on that aim?
I think we've made exceptional progress, particularly since the publication of the career strategy back in December 2017. So, this is obviously prior to lockdown, but we, that's not just me saying that. That's careers leaders in education, in schools and colleges saying that, where 75% of them saying careers education is getting better. I think it's business is got a really important voice with this. So, CBI's statement that the majority of their members are now engaged in supporting young people, I think is important. Young people themselves, clearly, in terms of the messages that they're giving about their own levels of confidence about making decisions, but also Ofsted as well. So, Ofsted's view that careers education has improved significantly, I think, is also notable. I think there's still a way to go. I mean,
sure.
and clearly the current situation is going to cause us to have to rethink, and refocus again.
Of course,
but I think significant improvements have been made since the point that you mentioned.
Okay, well, I'm sure towards the end of this interview, I'd like to come on actually to the impact of COVID-19, specifically on the whole challenge around information advice and guidance, both for young people and for adults. But last year, the Careers Enterprise Company assessed progress against something that's called the 8 Gatsby Foundation benchmarks for careers advice. And you found, for example, of nearly 4,000 educational settings that you surveyed, only 20% were addressing the needs of each individual pupil. You might want to say a bit about what the Gatsby Foundation benchmarks are, but why are outcomes so poor, John?
So, if I start out with the Gatsby Foundation benchmarks to start off with, because this was the first time that we've had a single, system structure in effect for judging what really great, best practice is in careers education. And I've been involved in careers education for a long time. And what it does is provide that unification and simple structure that everyone can understand. Underneath each of those 8 benchmarks, and they cover sort of, really clear areas.
I'll tell you what, just quickly, I'll list the 8 because I've got them here in front of me. So it's a stable career programme, learning from career and labour market information. 3rd, addressing the needs of each people, which is obviously the figure I gave you, 20%. 4th, linking curriculum learning to careers. 5, encounters with employers and employees. 6 is experiences of workplaces. 7 is encounters with further and higher education. And number 8, finally, is personal guidance. So they're the 8 benchmarks. And as you say, that's the first time, wasn't it, in that 2019 State of the Nation report where you'd specifically looked at those benchmarks against progress. And tell us what you found.
Yeah, so I think, firstly, we found that progress had been made against each of the benchmarks against previous assessments. Secondly, the number of schools and colleges that had completed that assessment was increasing. And there were some areas that were making significant progress, particularly those in terms of employer encounters. There were other benchmarks that still require a lot of further attention and development. So there's acknowledge the kind of mixed picture to that extent. But I think where I would just want to point out that each of those benchmarks has a range of measures underneath them that each school and college has to meet all of those different sub-elements to meet the full, the full benchmark. So it's quite an in-depth and it's quite a rigorous, it is a very rigorous process. Now, if a school and college is meeting them, 3/4 of them, they can't still tick the box to say that they've met that benchmark in full, and that's why you see, for example, in that the example you quoted, that you've got some where the performance looks quite low, but actually significant improvements are being made. Another one that I'm sure we might come on to is about the awareness of apprenticeships and links with independent trend finders and colleges.
Sure.
And that's, again, where, actually, if you look at the overall score, then it's still further work to do. But what it masks, in a way, is the increases in the individual measures that sit underneath that benchmark that have been made. So it's quite a nuanced approach, but what it is based on is best practice across the world. So it's a useful framework.
It is, and because it's quite comprehensive, as you say. It's not focusing just on one set of outputs or outcomes. It's actually looking across the whole piece, from labour market information through to individual needs, through to, as you say, linkages to employers and employees, but also further and higher education. I mean, interestingly, it's actually the encounters with employers, employees, 52%. That's the highest performing percentage as a benchmark currently, according to that 2019 survey anyway. But what, in your view, as chief exec of a national careers company, then would be, for some of these benchmarks, a kind of minimal or minimum percentage improvement?
I mean, ultimately, we want to get to a position where all schools are meeting all 8 benchmarks. I think it's difficult to set artificial. it's difficult. What I'm really there's a really important aspect to this, which is that schools and colleges themselves are grading their performance, and what I'm absolutely determined to avoid is a situation where this becomes a tick box exercise.
Sure.
It becomes a chasing the target, missing the point kind of culture that's created.
So
the idea of the integrity of this piece of work, I think, is fundamental. It's a fundamental principle. So actually enabling schools and colleges to self-assess and then base their improvement against that self-assessment, rigorous self-assessment that's being peer assessed by their colleagues, with some input from us as well. I think all of that is really important. So I'm going to sort of not be drawn. Ultimately, we want all schools and colleges to be able to meet all 8 benchmarks in full. That's the ambition.
Okay.
It's clearly fine. More that we can do.
Yeah, absolutely.
Support that.
The important thing, those benchmarks are there, and you can measure from time to time against them. So I think from a public transparency point of view, I think it's helpful. For parents, employers, students, teachers, the whole system to be able to look at that. Let's take an area then where, at least in law anyway, all schools and providers are meant to comply, and that's the so-called Baker Clause. This was an amendment to a piece of legislation that says, that schools and providers, sixth forms, etc., should be giving access, if you like, to local employers, to particularly providers, and that might include independent training providers or indeed other colleges that potentially might be taking the students of the sixth form, where the head teacher was hoping for those final year students to enrol in. So I think there's a bit of a tension, isn't there, in the system towards, certainly for sixth forms, to try and keep students on and perhaps give them exposure to advice and guidance that might in their own minds make them decide to move on. I mean, again, are you happy with the progress that we're making with the so-called Baker Clause? Because, the literature I read around it suggests that we've still got a long way to go before that's, again, realised.
Yeah, and this has been a long-standing issue. I mean, I think I recall, being working with a school with a sixth form 20 years ago that was complaining about independent advice taking students away. So it's not a new issue, but it does, it's still something that we recognise. It's contained within the Gatsby framework under that issue of independent access to training providers and to colleges, and we've seen good progress being made on both of those fronts, and to awareness to apprenticeships more generally as well. There's still areas to go. What we have seen is I think the new Ofsted framework that provided a strengthened focus on this. And whilst that's not the sort of stick that we want to use as an organisation, we're very much into the sort of improvement agenda. Clearly, for those schools where this has been a challenge, I think that has focused the minds somewhat as well. So improvements made, more to go, but it is a long-standing issue that has some structural elements to it in terms of the funding and for sixth form. So I think there's a broad range of issues at stake here.
Yeah, I mean, as you say, it's not particularly really a new issue. I mean, money's followed the learner in our system at both the school and post-compulsory level for a long time. So, I've always had a bit of sympathy, to those heads of sixth forms in particular, having been a former chair of a local education authority, who'll say to you, well, if they can't hold on to, in effect, the final year GCSE students they've got to go on and do A-levels in the sixth form, then potentially they've got themselves an economically unviable school, haven't they? So there are, as you say, these structural tensions in the system. I mean, do you think that part of the challenge is that there just isn't enough investment in this area in the first place? I thought it was interesting that a Careers England report found, this was a joint survey with the NAHT, found that on average only £5 was being spent per pupil. I mean, that seems like a measly amount of money going into something as important as future destinations and careers support. I mean, would you back a call for greater investment in this whole area?
I think investment is always welcome. Investment is important in terms of making the system work. We work as part of a system where it recognises the independence of schools and colleges and the ability for them to make decisions about the use of their budget. So yes, of course, I'd welcome investment in careers. I believe deeply in improving careers education and making that work. I think what's also important, however, is, and this sort of comes back to the point you were making about independent access, is about partnership. So where we've seen our biggest improvements, actually, which have been in the last 18 months, have been where you've had schools and colleges working together in local structures, which we're calling careers hubs, where sort of around 40 institutions working together. And they have achieved quite significant gains in improvement, and they've got the whole issue of independent sort of access applied through that peer lens as well, and that's been applied at a relatively efficient kind of cost. So I think that, of course, investment's welcome, but actually this is sometimes about making the best of partnership and approach that we can take at a local level. So that to me is also important.
All right. So it might not just be about investment; it could just be about the way the whole system is organised. And I mean, on that point, as you, I think, alluded there, Careers Hubs is something that the Public Accounts Committee and the Education Select Committee have also pointed to in their reports and have called for. I mean, arguably, they've also been critical from time to time of your organisation. I mean, would you go along with this sort of idea that was put forward by Robert Halfon, the chair of the Education Select Committee currently? I'm not sure he was chair when he made these comments, but it was certainly at an event that was launching a careers strategy. I mean, he was unequivocal in calling for what he described as a one-stop shop, a national skills service, sort of replacing lots of the current structures. I mean, do you think he has a point in any of that?
I mean, I've been involved in careers guidance in different guises, nearly 25 years. I've seen different structures come and go. I mean, so I think the important aspects of the current system for me are that it's based on a model that's researched the best systems around the world, that schools and colleges tell us it's working and improving, and it's improving across the country. So I know Steve Stewart's going to follow on from Careers England after me. I think he certainly has remarked to me previously about visiting Germany and asking has it worked in Germany, and the person there sort of saying well, we've only had 30 years of it, so we're not quite sure yet. It's about sometimes it's about longevity of structures rather than the structures themselves. So I think in terms of what I can comment on, that they're the sort of key elements I would sort of want to pull out, really.
And for those of us that have been around for a long time, whether it's in the career system or the skills system, we know all about the merry-go-round of changing structures, and unfortunately the temptation of some politicians, not all, but to think that just by rebadging something or launching something, somehow they've actually solved the problem. Anyway, John Yarham, Interim CEO of the Careers Enterprise Company, thanks so much for coming on this evening.
Thanks, Tom.
Thanks for taking the time.
Thank you. Cheers. Bye.
Bye.
You're listening to Skills World Live with Tom Buick.
Still got your pearls hanging by my bedside. Still got your lips on paper in a trash now. I never knew love could be so sweet. I never knew it would sting. I never knew love like this would leave me in pieces. Oh, Emily, when did you fall right out of love? Oh, Emily, when did the magic stop for us? Oh, but Emily, you are the part of me I feel. It will kill me when you leave and close my door. Oh, Emily. I can't believe it's already over. life is broken. I always thought love like ours would last. I never knew love could pass. Tomorrow comes and you are not around. Feels uneasy. Oh, Emily, when did you fall right out of love? Oh, Emily, when did the magic stop for us? Oh, but Emily, you are the part of me I feel. It will kill me when you leave and close my door. Who said it'd be easy to be in love? Who said that the sun would always shine? I'm not sure you realize what you are giving up. When did you fall right out of love? Oh, Emily, when did the magic stop for us? Oh, Emily, when did you fall right out of love? Oh, Emily, when did the magic stop for us? Oh, but Emily, you are the part of me I feel. It will kill me when you leave and close my door. Oh, Emily. Oh, but Emily, you are the part of me I feel. It will kill me when you leave and close my door. Oh, Emily.
That's a track called Emily from our old friends there over at epidemicsound.com. Now, to continue tonight's debate, I'm delighted to be joined by two people who definitely have very distinguished careers in this whole area, and I think we'll be able to really progress things on to the next stage. Delighted to be joined by Stewart Obe from Careers England, and Carolyn Parry, who's the founder, director and lead coach at Career Alchemy. Good evening, both.
Hi, how you doing?
Yeah, very well. Thanks for joining us. I think this is a really important debate, isn't it? And one that is right to dedicate a whole program to tonight. So, Steve, let's begin with you. I mean, I note from your CV that you were once involved in the connection service, which of course set up by the last Labour government. Do you think part of the problem in this space, and I was covering this point also with John just a few moments ago, but do you think part of the problem in this space is a bit like the skills system as a whole, is that we're always just structurally playing around with the deck chairs instead of creating a sustainable service that both young people and adults can relate to?
Well, I think you're absolutely right there. I mean, I've been, I started off working in local authorities, and then we were privatised in the 90s, and I ran a privatised company. Then we moved into the connection service, and then lo and behold, the coalition government scrapped that unexpectedly out of the blue to save some money, and now we've been struggling to get back to where we should be. So in terms of young people's services, I think that's absolutely right. I'm not sure it's the case for some of the adult services. You know, I'm focusing my mind onto the National Careers Service, but for young people's stuff, it's been stop, go, up and down, in and out. A bit of stability wouldn't be a bad thing.
Right, okay. Well, let's hold on to that thought and perhaps explore that a bit more in a few moments with you. But Carolyn, you were obviously clearly dissatisfied with the whole approach to careers support, otherwise you wouldn't have founded your own company in 2015, Career Alchemy. Yeah. So what's going wrong then with the current system? in your view?
Well, I'm not so sure it's going wrong. It's just more I was looking for an easier way to do it right.
Yeah, okay.
And I don't mean that in a funny way.
Yeah,
okay,
sure.
But what I mean is I spent 15 years in a university seeing student after student in tears, upset, lost, because they ended up in a place that they didn't recognise they couldn't make sense of because they hadn't had the support early enough to make the right decision for them. And having spent 15 years doing that, I got to I think it's time to do a little bit around prevention as well. And I'd worked in industry for 17 years before that, in the software industry for quite a while. And so I was used to looking at things in a process way as well. And I wanted to create an easy to follow process that was an 8-step process that had questions around it. It was a career coaching ethos all around positive psychology, helping everybody understand who they are and where they could go and make their specific difference in a world in a way that was meaningful to them. We spend a lot of time talking with people about skills, and that's no problem at all. The only problem is that you need to actually contextualize skills in a bigger context. And that, for me, is all around that individual why. And if a person has their why, they can find somewhere to go and do that why. If they don't know what they're looking for, it's very hard to find it, which is why we have, at work you get about 11%, according to Gallup figures, 11% of people are stars in the workplace in terms of employee engagement. The big 60-odd% in the middle are sleepwalkers, and then you get 20-odd% of saboteurs, the people who are disruptive in that workplace.
Right.
So that tells me there's only 11% of people who are intellectually, emotionally engaged, i.e. in the right place, doing the right thing that reflects who they are. And that's what I wanted to achieve, was a process that enabled people to find that, without all the sort of extensive trial and error that lots of people go through, bouncing from one job and career to the next in search of something, but not knowing what it is and how to find it and articulate it. Does that make some sense?
Yeah, it does. And obviously, if you applied that fascinating survey to the current 650-member House of Commons, that might tell you something about stars and saboteurs. Anyway, I won't expand on that argument any further. But you mentioned there your background in universities, and again, I actually didn't fully realise this until today, although I should really have known. And that's that, universities are kind of outside of any statutory framework that says, they have to provide independent advice and guidance. Obviously, many of them do, and you've got a background in that. Do you think there should be more of a requirement on universities then to ensure that young people really do understand, undergraduates actually, whether they're young or older, but they need to understand something about the destinations potentially they're headed to?
I think, in fairness, universities do a lot around destination data, and they've really understood employability well. I think what's happened is there's a gap between school and university where we need to work a bit harder to help young people make sure they're making the right choice. We had this sort of 50% of 18 to 30-year-olds should go to university benchmark. And I can tell you, lots of university people will tell you that sitting in a university, lots of people who are there are actually in the wrong place. And that's because they've not had enough support to make the vital decision beforehand. Now, universities do use their destination data because it's one of the key drivers for recruitment, not least, and it appears in the league tables. And therefore, they're very driven, universities, to making sure that their destinations out the other end are very good. So there's a lot of effort put around teaching within curriculum, but it's usually around that subject. It's quite often around that particular subject and how you therefore go and be somebody that uses maths or geography or whatever it is. The trouble is, if you're not wanting to use maths afterwards, you're getting careers advice, which is slightly shifting you in a direction you may not want to go or may not suit you. So I think there's some ground between school and university in that decision-making process where we have to be really clear that we put the investment, the time and the effort and the support in to help every young person understand who they are, what unique predisposed talents they have, where they want to go make a difference, and what matters to them. Because then if they've got that understanding, like a recipe, you can turn out the sort of cake, the decent cake afterwards. Or you might be making something, a curry that somebody wants, but it's about understanding what it is you want to eat at the end of the day in terms of career, if you'll forgive me for mixing a metaphor there.
That's okay. We always mix metaphors on this show. In fact, we make a habit of it.
Fantastic.
Which is brilliant.
Kindred spirits.
Now, Steve, obviously, Carolyn's making the point about investment in individuals, and you need quite a tailored sort of personalised approach. Now, that doesn't come cheap. That's not a sort of cookie cutter approach to information, advice and guidance. And, I just wondered to what extent, given that your organisation, Careers England and indeed NAHT, one of the unions, did this piece of research that I referenced at the top of the show with John about, on average, each secondary school pupil was getting just £5 per head to spend on impartial careers advice. Interestingly, and I'll be talking to him this week, Philip Auger in his review, which is approaching its anniversary, also said that the area had been underfunded. I mean, given your background, what scale of investment do you think is needed to make things like the 2013 statutory promise a reality in IAG?
Well, if you look at what we used to spend on careers, and you go back some years, we used to spend before connections around £225 million for school-based young people stuff.
Yeah.
We went up to 400 million as a nation. This is an England figure, and of course that encompassed a lot more than just careers. There's a lot of support in there. And if you do the analysis about what we're spending now, it's very, very hard to get an accurate figure because, of course, each school has now got the responsibility, and some schools do invest, some schools invest some money, and some schools don't invest hardly any money. But, you'll be talking about, in my head, you'll be talking to get the system to run as it should, to do the sorts of things that we're talking about, to make sure that young people are prepared to make the best decisions and know what they want to do, how they're going to do it. I think you're talking today around £300 million as a nation.
Do you know what that
equates to
money, per head?
But actually, Steve, the cost of it, the cost of not doing it, and the cost of young people dropping out of various provision courses, the cost of young people being unemployed is far in excess of that. And if you really are interested in, and you want something that helps you sleep, do go to our Careers England website. We've got a beautiful document there called the Economic Benefits of Careers Guidance, which actually demonstrates facts and figures around the value for money.
Okay. Well, I used to think that people suffering from insomnia listened to my show, but it's nice to know there's somebody else competing in that space. But you heard it here first. Obviously, head over to that website if you want to find out more about the value for money and investment criteria. Look, can I just ask you both finally, so over to you, Carolyn, now, and then I'll come back to you, Steve, on obviously the whole challenge going forward, because a lot of what we've discussed so far tonight has been a sort of retrospective look at some of the challenges, the issues, and where we are. This whole pandemic is going to unleash, sadly and tragically, and we've talked a lot about this on the show, a wave of youth unemployment, adult unemployment, structural long-term unemployment if we're not very careful, and that's where all these phrases like scarring and lost generation come in. But what would you say potentially needs to change, Carolyn, about the system going forward, just to, for example, accommodate? There's going to be 870,000 young people this year alone, 16 to 25-year-olds, potentially coming onto the labour market or moving on to further and higher education. It's a massive figure.
Absolutely, it's a massive figure. And actually, I'm going to want to pick up on what you said just now about the approach I was talking about not being a cookie-cutter approach. In fact, that's exactly what we've done. We've taken a process. We've got research proof it works. It's an 8-unit module. We run it on Facebook it's our gesture. And we've got a community of volunteers from the career development sector, all members of the CDI, all helping me. And it's called Inspired Teenager Plus. It's on Facebook, free to join. And what we're doing is we're taking parents and their teenagers together through a career choice program where we have 3 20-minute sessions Monday, Wednesday, Friday, some activities for them to do, special guests like Daisy, who was the PR behind Captain Tom's story. She's been on to provide some inspiration.
Oh, we love him.
We had Liz Wright, Paralympian athlete medalist, disability activist. But we're taken through a career coaching, career guidance process in a sequential way that once learnt they can use any time of their life again in the future. And I do know from our experiences with hundreds and hundreds of people of all ages that what we've got works because everybody has a future. Everybody can want to make a difference. And it's that sort of language we're using, which is different from skills and applications and jobs and CVs, which is all great, but it's the other end of the process from the what am I going to do bit. Yeah,
and what an inspiration in Captain Tom Moore at the age of 99. He basically
stunning
retrained for a whole new career as a professional fundraiser, it seems. But anyway, that's brilliant.
And so everybody can do something, and I think that's the point. And therefore we look to see what somebody wants as a purpose where they can make a difference.
Steve, last word to you. COVID-19, the challenges of it. I don't need to say too much other than that, really. Where do you see IAG going?
Well, I think there's two things I think we've got to do. If we're going to actually give people the support they need in what is going to be the worst recession stroke depression than certainly I've experienced in my 42 years in the careers sector. The first one is we've got an excellent service for adults called the National Careers Service.
Yeah.
Nobody knows about it, and actually it's time to start promoting that service and to make people aware.
Do you think that, Steve, that service should merge with the Careers Enterprise Company? I don't want to put you on the spot on that, but that's been one of the recommendations out there floating around.
Well,
I've seen.
I mean, the Careers and Enterprise Company is doing a lot of work to help schools basically get better, and colleges for that matter as well, get better. I think its biggest challenge is that, and this moves into my second point, is that schools, as the law stands today and the guidance stands today, should do good work to prepare young people through good careers education and good careers guidance. But the word is should. If you look at the data, my view is you look at the data, around a third do a very good job, a third do some things, and a third do very little. I would change that, and I think the government's got to change that to be more assertive, to move from should to must.
Yeah. Okay.
Stroke require, because at the moment some do, some don't. And if you're a young person, do you get good careers help? Actually, depends on the school you go to.
Postcode lottery.
Because they're all different.
Yeah.
And that shouldn't be right. Indeed. You should have the same, regardless of your postal address.
Yeah, absolutely. Steve Stewart, OBE, Careers England, and Carolyn Parry, founder director and lead coach at Career Alchemy. Thanks for coming on Skills World Live this evening.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Take care. Cheers.
You're listening
Bye.
to Skills World Live with Tom Buick.
Do you miss me at all? Do you think about the things we used to do? No, you couldn't stand tall. So why didn't you call? So many years has gone by, but I think about you all the time. Looks like you're changing and all. But why didn't you call? Something in the air, always something in the air. Inexplicable, I can feel it in the air. Can you feel me? Can you feel me?
That's Can You Feel Me by Love Beans. And talking of two lovely people, I'm delighted to close this segment of the show. We're joined by Dr. Deirdre Hughes, OBE of DMH Associates, and Chris Webb, who's an employability advisor at Sheffield Hallam and co-host. He's got his own podcast show as well called The New Normal. I'll have to check that out. Good evening to you both.
Good evening.
Hi. Deirdre, let's start with you. I mean, you were a former commissioner on the UK Commission for Employment and Skills, obviously before that was wound up, and you've advised several skills ministers in this space. Given tonight's debate, what's your advice to Gillian Keegan, the current skills minister, about the future of careers advice and guidance?
Well, I think, if the question is it fit for purpose? If we're looking at the system in England at the moment, the answer is no, it isn't fit for purpose at the current time. And there's lots that could be done to actually reduce the fragmentation and indeed the inequity in career support, particularly, for young people. And I think we've got to give the minister some clear messages as to how best to improve.
So what would those messages be? Put you on the spot. But if you're just writing one or two of them down now, scribbling them down, I'm going to see Gillian Keegan.
I think just building on what Stewart said, what the minister will want to know how we can improve the current arrangements. So it's important not to throw the baby out with the bathwater.
Sure.
But I think the key message for the minister is that, look at the young person's journey. And in England, there are no visible local places or spaces for young people to actually get careers advice. So the minister needs to fix that, particularly in a time of high unemployment that sort of lies before us. I think also in terms of the system that we have in England, it's costly because it is so fragmented. There are pockets of money spent in lots of different places. And I think I call it the careers experiment in England. We've been in careers experiment mode for 7 years now.
Right.
And I think it's time now. There's a great opportunity to say, let's set up a youth employment task force. Let's actually follow the money and look at how that money is being spent. And listening to your earlier presenter, John Yarham, with the Careers and Enterprise Company, I think one of the big problems in England is there's been a over-fixation on Gatsby benchmarks at the expense of actually those young people who are not in school or who are actually, in their local communities, in their bedrooms, where actually have been left many to their own devices with very worried parents.
Are there examples elsewhere in the United Kingdom? Because you're quite right to, we've obviously focused on England this evening. It is a 4-country system, obviously, for employment and skills, including career support these days. But are there examples in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, Deirdre, that you could point to that you think we should be learning from in terms of their success?
Absolutely.
Give us a flavour of who they are.
Perhaps a minister might not like to have a look at the Celtic nations to see what they're doing. But we have in Scotland a new careers strategy, which has been very much around bringing the partners together to actually work up the action plan. So it's actually, rather than imposed from the top, it's organic and is developing in Scotland. And if you Google the careers strategy for Scotland, you can see some of the key ingredients. And that also involves bringing the higher education careers providers around the table with the schools and the college careers providers as well, to try and maximise resources.
Sure. Well, look, that's a really great point to segue then through to you, Chris. You're obviously working in higher education. You're in the world of employability and careers advice. And as I think mentioned earlier, there is no requirement on universities to provide impartial careers advice and guidance to young people. Many of them do. Some of it's very high quality. But what's your sort of response there to Deirdre, who's sort of pointing to the fact that some efficiencies could be found by greater integration, but importantly, more effective support to young people and adults could be found if we learnt, for example, from some of these Celtic models where there is that, if you like, tertiary education view of tertiary education then docking with employment and skills, as opposed to the sort of fragmentation that we have in England, where there's not only obviously a lot of institutional differences, but of course just the sheer size of the population of England. There's also now, with the 8 devolved combined areas, they're potentially wanting to do their own things as well in careers advice. It's not just a Whitehall edict anymore, is it? So what's your experience from the HE front line?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I think it's hard to disagree with Deirdre, really. I mean, I think I read the recent career strategy from Scotland. In fact, actually, the minister who's announced it on Twitter, the quote that came with that, I thought, wow, I would love that to be our Minister for Skills or our, Minister for Education delivering that sort of statement about.
Can you remember it? Can you paraphrase it?
Essentially,
Deirdre can.
I suppose it was to do with the kind of the holistic benefits.
Yes,
and I think that's where, as Deirdre rightly said, and I think Carolyn mentioned it earlier in terms of that transition between school and university, that's where potentially we've got this sort of discord at the moment. And I guess it's kind of quite similar in a way to sort of what we've heard about education, during the pandemic, all this stuff around, it's vital that people don't miss education. Yeah, totally agree with that. But also I think we also hear a lot of stuff around lifelong learning, how important that is, which almost seems to go out of the window when we get to situations like this. And I think it's exactly the same with careers. A number of graduates that I work with who kind of come back to us as a university maybe 2, 3, 4, 5 years plus after graduating, only to realise that, of course, the degree that they did, understandably, wasn't necessarily going to be the thing that they followed, for the rest of their career. And I think that's why sometimes what we have in England, I think maybe is a little bit too data, destination, result driven, and maybe focusing more on the outcomes in terms of, in the HE sector, for example, graduate outcomes, are they in professional level employment, rather than actually kind of looking at it at a holistic point of view that, much like education, careers guidance is going to be something that you need throughout your life. It's not something that stops once you finish school or college or university.
Absolutely. So, I mean, I think that's a really strong and valid point about lifetime, just like we have lifelong learning. We need access to careers advice and guidance. Obviously, people go throughout their working lives periods they might be made redundant, or they might be restructured out of a particular occupation or a sector. Or indeed, with the challenges, things like the Fourth Industrial Revolution, that occupation may be completely obsolete. So it's obvious, with average life expectancy, well, it's stalled at the moment, but there's lots of people already talking about more and more people are going to be enjoying the Tom Moore centenarian lifestyles going forward. I mean, do you think, Deirdre, that that's part of the challenge as well? We've just piled too much of an expectation on the IAG services that somehow they've got to map out a whole person's career, when in fact that's just not realistic, is it? Maybe it's about having more of a universal access to that support, regardless of where you are in your particular occupation or particular education journey. What do you think to that, Deirdre?
Yeah, absolutely, Tom. And if we look at Wales, for example, I know you had Ken Skates.
Yeah, we did.
Talking recently about a youth guarantee. But if you look in Wales, they have a major initiative called Working Wales, #Change Your Story. It basically is there to motivate and help individuals who, whose jobs might be at risk or who might be vulnerable individuals, to give that kind of positive messaging around career support is really about helping people to become resilient and to be adaptable. And I think sometimes the problem is that people think, careers is old-fashioned. I went to my careers advisor, and often that careers advisor is a teacher, not a trained careers advisor. So I think a good example also is in Northern Ireland, and I think this is a message for the Minister here in England, is in Northern Ireland, the civil service, which actually runs the career service in Northern Ireland, are guaranteeing every school leaver an interview, a careers interview with a trained and qualified careers advisor. Now in England, we're about to have the huge numbers of young people who'll be uncertain about their exam situation, their results, their futures. And I think the Minister could actually step up now and actually look at what resources perhaps haven't been spent and actually apply those resources to a year 11, year 13 guaranteed interview for every young person. So that, Northern Ireland is doing this, albeit it's a smaller country. But I think it's time now to look at a rethink of how the resource that's currently available is being spent. And I'll be a little bit controversial around saying that the enterprise passport, which Lord Young had envisaged through the Careers and Enterprise Company, a lot of money was spent on that, and it went absolutely nowhere. Same with virtual wallets. So I think it's time now to say, put these young people at the heart of the system, and adults, as they have done in Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland. And if we look further afield, my work takes me sort of internationally.
Yeah, with CEDAFOP, I saw that. Yeah, in your
France, adults who work in small companies are guaranteed a careers interview to help with their lifelong learning. It's in legislation. In France,
as so much in France often is. But Deirdre, I mean, I think you've bubbling with some great ideas there, and thanks for bringing in examples indeed from around our own United Kingdom. And I know that Gillian Keegan does listen to the show, she told me, so hopefully she'll ask one of her officials to go and have a look at that Northern Ireland example. Now, Chris, last word to you for alas, we have to wrap up the show, and what's been a fascinating discussion this evening. What role do you see then universities playing as we go forward? I mean, obviously a huge challenge potentially of youth unemployment, adult unemployment. Obviously there's a role for universities potentially to offer additional places and for the government to fund them, etc., etc. But what's the role potentially in also helping people reassess their careers going forward?
Yeah, I think it's, as Deirdre's mentioned, it's a complex picture. And I think one thing that I would say, I suppose, just from the off is that at all stages in England, the places I've worked in sort of FE in schools and in higher education, and even done some volunteering in sort of adult guidance, there are really, really committed professional people doing excellent work. And I think the problem, as Deirdre's mentioned, is almost systemic and structural.
Sure.
We have these great pockets of work going on. And I think what kind of frustrates me a little bit sometimes, I suppose, is it can be quite a reductive discourse, both around careers, but also around, I think, the either or, technical, vocational, or academic, as if the two can't coexist and aren't useful, side by side. And we've seen that with kind of T-levels, A-levels, university apprenticeships, etc. So I think for a start, I think that sort of needs to be addressed, that idea of actually, should be a collective, holistic system that's there to benefit people, finding the right pathway at the right time for them. But I think from the university point of view, actually, there's stuff that's actually happening at the moment that's really useful. So the Civic University Network, I would say, is probably something worth looking at. That's something that Sheffield Hallam recently took the chair of, looking at how kind of universities can contribute to the wider, I suppose, sort of societal input. And that's something where careers and employability services are also getting involved in terms of thinking about how we can encourage students to think about that lifelong sort of careers guides and kind of putting back, a bit like Carolyn mentioned earlier, the purpose of a career and not just the transactional stuff in terms of CVs and employability.
Well, that sounds absolutely fascinating and actually a really positive note to end tonight's show on as well. So Chris Webb, Sheffield Hallam University, and Dr. Deirdre Hughes, OBE. Thanks to you both. Pleasure talking to you this evening.
Thanks for having me, Tom.
You're listening to Skills World Live with Tom Buick.
What a great debate this evening. Information, advice and guidance. Who said that was boring? Lots of work to do, clearly, in England. Thanks to all the guests tonight. It's been fantastic. So that's another glorious 60 minutes of Skills World Live tonight, looking at the whole challenge of careers advice and guidance. Tomorrow night, we've got a slightly extended show, but only because Gavin O'Mara, the editor, has got so many people now that want to come on that we're just going to have to accommodate all these bigwigs. It's the anniversary this week of the Philip Auger review. Remember that comprehensive post-16 review of the tertiary education system, probably the first we've had properly anyway for 50 years. I'll be talking to the man himself, Mr. Philip Auger, about his reflections on the last year and what he's hoping for the Boris Johnson government to implement. So, if you want to be on the show, don't forget, just email us at skillsworld@fenews.co.uk. Skills World Live is an FE News production, and it's supported by the Federation of Awarding Bodies Platinum Partners Programme. Just before I go, I must say thank you as well to our brilliant digital producer, Ellie Hansen. Goodbye.